Welcome to ZKast, everybody. I'm Zscaler from ZK Research, and here for another thought leadership video. I'm joined today by Rich Campagna, SVP of Cloud Protection at Zscaler. And Rich, given your title and the company you work for, I think it's obvious we're going to be talking about cloud security. Before we get going, though, I do want to give a quick shout out to eWeek. eWeek is ZK Research media partner. All ZKasts are done in conjunction with the eWeek eSpeaks program. So, Rich, thanks for joining me. As I mentioned before, you work for Zscaler. For those not familiar with the company, can you tell us a bit about Zscaler? Tell us about yourself and what you do there.
Yeah, absolutely, Zayas. And thank you for having me today. So Zscaler is a company that has done phenomenally well in the cybersecurity space over the last 10 or 15 years. We're deployed in more than 7,000 major enterprises globally, and really we provide protection, cloud delivered protection in a number of different areas. First of all, most organizations know us for user-based protection. So we have two kind of flagship product offerings in that area, one of which provides secure access to the internet and to SaaS applications for employees and partners and any other user that has, human user that has access to resources from inside of an organization. And the other is a zero trust based platform for providing secure access to internal applications, whether they run in a private data center or in a public cloud environment. So it's a pretty comprehensive set of solutions for providing user protection to basically any application or service they need access to. That's how most people know Zscaler, but we've invested equally heavily in a similar set of solutions, but for protecting workloads. And specifically what we're going to be talking about today is that portion of Zscaler's platform, which is very much focused on protecting workloads that live in the public cloud with a couple of key platforms, one of which extends our network and proxy-based services to public cloud workloads, and the other which is all about risk visibility and mitigation for assets that run in public cloud environments like AWS, Azure, and GCP.
Yeah, thanks. And I've been following Zscaler for a while, and I must say that the meteoric rise you guys have had. I mean, security companies grow pretty fast, but you guys have outpaced even the traditional growth of security companies. That's been pretty impressive. So, as you mentioned, we're going to talk cloud security, or CNAPP, I think, which is the term that's being used in the industry, which to me is a much easier way of saying cloud native application protection platform, or more simply posture control. Gartner has its own definition of that, but I want to hear from you how Zscaler defines it, and more importantly, though, why it's important today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, at the million-foot level, let's start there. A CNAPP helps an organization build, deploy, and run secure applications in the public cloud. Right, that's a very vague term, and there's probably about 10 or 12 different types of technologies that could also fall under that bucket. But CNAPP is really a consolidation of what previously were a number of different point products available to the enterprise to help us help achieve their cloud security objectives. And importantly, CNAPP does a couple of things. One, it helps an InfoSec team become more efficient in terms of risk mitigation in the public cloud, and it does this by pulling in signals from a number of different sources to help identify and prioritize risk to the organization. So that's one. If an InfoSec team is able to work on the highest priority or the highest risk items facing their organization's public cloud deployment, they become more efficient. And CNAPP also helps them to collaborate more effectively with their development and DevOps counterparts by integrating into that development lifecycle, starting all the way from when the developer is writing code all the way through to the deployment and run phase of an application, with the idea being that the organization would prefer to identify and mitigate risks as early as possible in that lifecycle, not only because it helps prevent risks and weaknesses from making their way into production cloud environments, but it helps maintain the pace of innovation, right? It's far less costly and less time consuming for an organization if they can identify, let's say, a vulnerability or misconfiguration as the developer is writing code, as opposed to waiting for that application or service or whatever it may be to get into production. Security flags it, it gets passed back to the developer for rework, and you lose weeks, if not months to do that. So it's really about maintaining the pace of innovation in the public cloud while mitigating risks as effectively as possible.
Yeah, I chuckled when you were talking about that because before I was an analyst, I was actually a former IT pro. I held the CIO role for a while, and the norm was certainly application developer goes and builds something, we roll it out in production, we find all the security issues, we repeal it from production, we spend a lot of money fixing it quickly, roll it back out, and kind of go through that dance. And so I think that the ultimate goal here of building security into the development process certainly short circuits that. And when you think about the world today, right, like businesses compete on customer experience. I think from a user perspective, if you're dealing with a company that's got buggy, software and things like that, that certainly drives you away from those brands, right? So this isn't just about security. This is about the overall, health of a business and how they compete and go to market today, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I actually think, I was thinking about this actually just earlier this morning. I saw something on LinkedIn that someone had posted that made me think of pretty much exactly what you're thinking about. I think with the move to public cloud, there's become this sort of balance of power shift, right? In a private data center, the security team could be that gating, sort of resource and just, say,
guys
hey,
that get in the way.
Yeah, this is not going. But now, the developer has the power, right? The developer, it's just an API or a button click away, from some new service being provisioned into the cloud, sensitive data going up into the cloud. And there's not really much that anyone can or really should want to do to prevent that from happening. And so there's been this balance of power shift. And I think there's two ways to look at that, right? From a security team standpoint. One is that, hey, this is perhaps an existential threat to us as an InfoSec team as a whole. As we move to the cloud, more and more kind of security responsibility goes to the developer. That's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is that this can help the InfoSec team not only better achieve their goals, but become more strategic to the organization, where they're able to to mitigate risks, protect the enterprise, but do so in a way that's much more aligned to the business than they ever have been before. And that's kind of our view here from a Zscaler standpoint is let's help the InfoSec team collaborate with these folks so that they ultimately collectively become more successful in terms of achieving the business goals, which includes not only security, but innovation as well.
Yeah. Now you had mentioned the term DevOps, and I'm glad you did that because there's a lot of industry chatter about DevOps and DevSecOps these days, right? And that largely, especially for modernized application, has become the path forward, which I think does create some challenges for the security team. So what are you seeing from your customer base in the way of how security teams are working with DevSecOps and DevOps and what new challenges that brings?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is something that I alluded to just a second ago, which is that automation and the power and availability of all these different cloud services that are out there can be incredibly powerful from an innovation standpoint. But automation also allows, if not properly managed, for massive weaknesses, vulnerabilities, what have you, to make their way across broad swaths of the organization application footprint very quickly, right? And so it's a powerful tool, but also one that I don't want to use the word misuse, but if improperly used, can lead to a really big security issues. And this is where the problem lies, right? In the past, as I mentioned before, the security team can be that gate and then just say, hey, you know what, we're not gonna provision this VM, until you patch these vulnerabilities in your application code, and therefore you're not going to achieve your goal as a developer. In the cloud world, the developer or the DevOps person, they're continuously deploying new applications and services, and there's no such gate in place. These people have the power to do the complete provisioning of that infrastructure, and then the applications and data and whatever else runs on that infrastructure. And so that's the big challenge, right? How does, in a world where there's continuously new applications, services, and data being rolled out, not to mention the fact that the cloud providers themselves have hundreds of services, and they're innovating on a daily basis, not only within those services, but creating new services, each of which has a sort of a distinct and unique risk profile. you have a really difficult situation for security teams. They've lost all that control of deciding what and when goes into a production environment, and so they have to figure out ways to work with the DevOps teams and integrate as seamlessly as possible into their workflows. And I think that's one of the opportunities that CNAPP can bring.
Yeah. So staying on that. So staying on that thread, I understand how CNAPP can help run secure apps, but can you go into a bit of detail on how it actually helps in the build process?
Yeah, absolutely. So, fundamentally, the sets of policies that a CNAPP can provide are oriented around either things like misconfigurations or excessive permissions or other types of issues and sort of the infrastructure and services deployment into the cloud provider, right? How are we gonna kind of build sort of that infrastructure in which your application runs? So that's sort of the base or the foundation layer, and then above that is more application and data centric types of scanning, things like vulnerability scanning of a container or VM image, scanning of a data source, maybe an object store in one of these big providers for sensitive data, and so it's looking at all of these things, but these types of issues can be identified even before some of that stuff gets deployed. And the way that a CNAPP does that, to directly answer your question, is with native integrations into the workflows that the developers and DevOps folks are already using. But at the end of the day, if the security team has to go to a developer and say, hey, in order to identify where you have issues, we need you to learn a new tool, some new CNAPP tool, from some vendor you haven't heard of, Zscaler or whoever else competes in this space. And then you need to go and check in with that tool every time you're trying to, to work through a new project. That's sort of a losing proposition. But if, on the other hand, the security team can go to that developer or the DevOps engineer and say, hey, listen, there's a native plugin into your, Visual Studio Code or into GitHub or into Jenkins or any of these tools that are used kind of across that lifecycle. And as you are doing the work that you're already doing, we're going to flag to you where you have security violations, and we're going to decide where in that life cycle we're going to provide sort of a gating action. Then you have something that is tightly integrated into their native workflows and allows them to identify without a context switch and without learning a new tool exactly what the issue is, how they fix it, and why it's important that they fix it. And so it becomes a much better sort of process from a developer standpoint, because they don't have to interrupt their work, and they know as soon as they're typing the code, hey, this is the issue. And so that's what a CNAPP does. It's not just scanning what's in the cloud, but it's scanning what's going to be in the cloud across that entire life cycle and providing point in time and place remediation.
Right now, and so that's interesting, and I know a CNAPP though isn't a panacea for all security issues. So specifically, what types of security risks can a CNAPP identify, and specifically on which assets?
Yeah, great question. CNAPP is specifically targeted towards workloads that are running in public cloud environments. So all the major CNAPP vendors will support at the very least the big three cloud providers: AWS, Azure, and GCP. And within those, they'll start by building capabilities that were previously part of tools like Cloud Security Posture Management or Cloud Infrastructure Entitlement Management, a few other types of tools. Scanning, start by building the inventory of everything they have running across that multi-cloud environment, looking at basically the posture, to use a term that you used earlier. How have these things been configured? Are they aligned to our compliance objectives, or we're following CIS or NIST, or we have our own security policies and governance? As we're continuously deploying into this infrastructure, are we maintaining sort of this risk posture that is that is aligned to our security compliance objectives? So that's one piece, right? How is the cloud configured and deployed? And then on top of that, it's looking at the data and the assets themselves. So a CNAPP will do something like scan the data that has been deployed across the public cloud infrastructure and identify, depending on the organization, something like PII or where you use the data source code, what have you, because that's an important part of a risk equation. And it will also look at things like your container, your VM, your serverless function assets, and scan those for vulnerabilities. So what it's doing is looking at kind of the underlying infrastructure and the way that the cloud services have been deployed, but then also what's running inside of that infrastructure, and providing you this true sense of risk by correlating and tying all these different pieces together, and then prioritizing what is going to be the most important thing facing the organization.
Yeah, I think one of the other big misunderstandings too about using these public cloud providers is while they provide a lot of security, they're not ultimately responsible for your security, right? That's something companies, and I think often businesses get surprised that, well, we were using this provider and they offer certain levels of security, but it doesn't protect you against everything. So this puts some of the control back in your hands. Now the rise of cloud though has been interesting because it's given rise to a lot of security tools that begin with the letter C, right? So right, Cloud Access Security Broker.
Very creatively named.
Yeah, you mentioned Cloud Security Posture Management, CSPM. There's also cloud workload protection platforms like CWPP, and so there's, and then of course there's CNAPP, right? And so there's a lot of these new cloud security tools. And does the CNAPP, what's the relationship of CNAPP to these other ones? Does it eliminate them? Is it a superset? Does it work with them? How should customers think about all these different cloud security tools?
Yeah, so ultimately, a CNAPP can help to eliminate some of those tools, right? I mean, listen, I work at a vendor, and like every other, sort of big trend in the industry here, when a new problem space, new attack surface, comes out, there's a lot of different point products that are built by these vendors, each of which have some of their own sort of siloed view of the world and their own sort of purview of protection. And that's no different here with all your C acronyms that you just mentioned. That's exactly the same thing that has happened here. We've come out and we've, Zscaler as well has built a number of different sort of individual point products, each of which have their own sort of slice of the public cloud world. That is good for some period of time, but eventually the organization, the enterprise needs some consolidation. They don't want to run a dozen different security tools to help protect their public cloud infrastructure. And that CNAPP is very much about, become a consolidation platform for what's running in the public cloud. So things like CSPM, CIEM, CWPP, most other C acronyms will eventually get subsumed into the CNAPP area. And in fact, that's what we've done with our own product, right? We had a standalone CSPM, CIEM, and CWPP platform. We took a lot of the technology and the learning, and certainly the engineering teams from those platforms, and put all of that into this new platform that was built from the ground up to kind of more comprehensively address this space.
Yeah. Now, with that being said, though, you still do have other security tools, and security has largely moved away from being signature-based to analytic-based, which makes the data set that you're working with important. And so describe the process of kind of correlating information across threats and why that's important.
Yeah, I would say that correlation, we haven't talked about it yet in this discussion, but it's probably the most important aspect of a CNAPP. You have something very obvious like what I just talked through, which is consolidation of tools. That has some value, but I mean, ultimately you get single sign-on and a single UI. But the correlation is the important thing here. And let me give you an example. Let's say you have a container that's running in one of the big cloud providers. Let's just pick AWS. And that container has an unpatched vulnerability on it. And that unpatched vulnerability has a CVSS score of 9.5, right? Critical vulnerability. Maybe this is, I don't know, Log4j or some other, big vulnerability that's breaking in the news. And what the question the InfoSec team needs to answer is this important for me to bug my developer about fixing right now? And the answer to that is that it depends, right? If that particular asset is running, in a Amazon VPC that is fully air gapped from any other resource, right? There's no access to any sensitive data in the organization. There's no access to the internet, and it's just running on its own. that probably doesn't represent a lot of risk to the organization. There are probably far less critical severity vulnerabilities that need to be patched sooner. But if that same container is running in a production environment that has access to sensitive data and has a security group misconfiguration that is exposing that asset to the internet, now all of a sudden you have a much different situation. Same vulnerability, but now you have an asset that has a remotely exploitable vulnerability. And if someone were to exploit that and gain access to that container asset, they can then use the privileges that that asset has to get access to sensitive data in your organization. So this is what correlation is all about, right? That tiny little example I just talked through is looking at vulnerability management, data loss prevention, cloud security posture management. And the enterprise has all these tools already in their arsenal. The challenge is that correlating just that small, tiny example together is incredibly time consuming, if not impossible, with individual point tools.
It's certainly impossible.
CNAPP brings it all together, right?
Sorry. Just the volume of data has gotten so large in security, even the best security pros. I think even 10 years ago, it was near and impossible for security pros to do manually, or even through a SIM and things like that. So clearly automation is a much more important part of it. Now, you recently held your Zenith Live event, and
Yep.
Zscaler introduced your own CNAPP. So could you tell me about the product? But then also, there's a lot of vendors in the space today. So can you talk through some of the differentiators that makes your product different?
Yeah, absolutely. So the product is Zscaler's sort of comprehensive approach to going after and taking leadership in this CNAPP space. We've had this under development for well over a year, and we have a couple hundred engineers fully dedicated to not only delivering the initial product but innovating on it on an ongoing basis. So what makes it different? A couple of things that I think I'll point out. One is this tight integration between what's running in the cloud environment and the entire development lifecycle. They're up to date. There have been a lot of tools that have been focused on one side of that or the other, and we've built this from day one to not only scan what's running in the cloud environment, but use those same sets of policies with these tight, native plugin integrations into a wide range of IDEs, version control systems, DevOps tools, et cetera, so we can achieve that sort of close collaboration with development and DevOps that I talked about previously. So that's an important piece here. Second important piece is that I think that the obvious, as a longtime sort of product person myself, the obvious easy path to building a product like this is to take some of the individual assets we had in the past and put them together in the same user interface with single sign-on, but they still fundamentally become sort of ships in the night. But that correlation I talked about before is the most critical aspect here. And so what we've done is we've built this from the ground up with a single data store, the single graph-based data store that is correlating across all these areas and really doing a fantastic job of doing risk-driven prioritization to help the InfoSec team become more efficient. So that's sort of probably the second area. And maybe the last area that I'll offer is probably the most obvious one for people that follow Zscaler closely, which is integrations into the broader Zscaler platform. We have a tremendous number of assets that we've been delivering to thousands of organizations for years now that have a lot of differentiation in the space. Fundamentally, most CNAPPs are looking at APIs available from the various different cloud vendors and pulling data from that cloud. But there's a lot of additional context that can be gained by looking at the behavior of some of those assets on the network, which is certainly something that Zscaler can do. Looking at and identifying where you have sensitive data in these environments and tying that back into the risk equation. Looking at some of that network traffic and tying into the threat capabilities that we've built over the years as well. So that's kind of an important differentiator as well for us is harnessing the power of that broader Zscaler platform.
Yeah, and I want to sort of reiterate my own view on the correlation piece of that. In data sciences, right, there's an expression that says good data leads to good insights. But the corollary is true too, where fragmented data leads to partial insights. And I poke fun at a couple of your competitors for being the market leader in single panes of glass, where it seems like they got a single pane of glass for everything. So I think that one platform and that one data set actually becomes very meaningful when trying to do analytics and things. So anyways, Rich, I just have one more question for you. Without getting into anything that's
Sure, yeah.
NDA or too forward looking, what's the roadmap for CNAPP here? What can customers expect to see?
Yeah, I think you'll see, you know, at a very high level, you know, continued innovation around, you know, just sort of workflow and making things easier, right? We want to be the easiest, not only product to deploy, but to operationalize in the space. And as you know, one of the things we talked about today was, you know, how can the InfoSec team fit in this new area? And part of, you know, the way they can do that is by achieving their objectives while at the same time making everyone else's job as easy as possible. So that's, you know, sort of one area where you'll see, you know, we have some fantastic innovation coming down the pike just around, you know, sort of smoothing, you know, workflows and integrations into the work that other folks in the organization are doing. And I think the other big area is around, you know, some of these Zscaler platform integrations that I talked about before. You know, a lot of our customers are already using us to protect their public cloud workload access to either to the internet or internally across a hybrid cloud or multi-cloud type of environment. So that's inline, you know, runtime protection. That combined with the CNAPP provides a lot of benefits, right? The CNAPP understands sort of the risk posture of that asset, VM, what have you, can feed that into our network-based services to do dynamic policy evaluation. So for example, if a particular asset has a high amount of risk, we can feed that in and provide a more restricted access for that asset as it accesses other services inside of the organization. And then as well on the runtime piece, you know, when we see things like suspicious behavior of an asset, that can be fed back into the CNAPP platform, which then ties into remediation. Maybe it kicks back to the developer and says, hey, we're seeing this particular asset has some sensitive behavior. Perhaps it's been compromised. There's some sort of supply chain issue like we saw with SolarWinds last year, or you know, perhaps you need to upgrade to the latest base image, whatever this Linux distribution is. So I think that's probably to me the most exciting, you know, future is how do we tightly correlate between the network control that Zscaler already has in so many organizations with this sort of out-of-band visibility that CNAPP can provide.
All right, Rich. Well, congratulations on the launch. And
Thank you.
You know, for those of you watching this video, I just want to give my own personal opinion here, right? Security teams have largely lived in silos, so have developers, frankly. And you know, I think when you look at sort of the path of modern businesses and digital businesses, that model can exist no longer. And so, you know, CNAPP helps become that bridge that brings those two worlds together, and I think is certainly as necessary a part of anything as you know, as any other part of security moving forward. So certainly worth taking a look at if you haven't deployed. So on behalf of Rich Campagna from Zscaler, I'm Zeus Caravala. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to click subscribe, and I'll see you next time on ZKast.